Hello everyone, welcome back to PS113 Introduction to Psychology, Chapter 11, Personality Theory and Assessment. Now in Part 1, we discussed personality, the definition. I introduced you to Freud and psychoanalysis, along with his 3 levels of consciousness, including the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. This is Part 2, and I want to pick up with some examples of unconscious behavior, Freud's use of the iceberg, to understand levels of consciousness, and his structure of personality, featuring the id, ego, and superego. So here we go. I want to go over a couple of examples of unconscious motivation in behavior. A young man tells his analyst that he has become engaged to his girlfriend. The analyst says, "Congratulations. I think you'll be a fine husband. Tell me more." The patient goes on to explain that he loves his girlfriend. She's beautiful. She has her own career. She loves children and she wants to start a family. The analyst agrees that these are all good reasons to get married, but might offer some unconscious motivation. She could say that unconsciously, your girlfriend reminds you of your mother, whom you've talked about and had incestuous sexual feelings for in childhood. And since you can't marry your mother, you've transferred these feelings onto your fiancé. Here's another example. A young woman tells her therapist that she has decided to go into medicine and become a surgeon. The therapist says, "Congratulations. I think you'll be a fine doctor. Tell me more." The patient goes on to explain that she was inspired to make this career choice because her father recently underwent a life-saving surgery. The therapist agrees that this is a noble reason for going into medicine, but might offer some unconscious motivation. He could say that while you love your father, you've also discussed much anger towards him during your childhood. And while you can't physically hurt your father in revenge, you can physically cut on others with knives and sharp objects and transfer hostile feelings towards them. Freud frequently used an iceberg as an analogy to personality. And here's how it works. How much of the iceberg, do they say, is visible above water? Maybe 10 to 15%, right? The largest part of the iceberg is underwater. It's there, but you can't see it. Freud theorizes that the mind is like the iceberg. The conscious mind is but a small part, while the unconscious is much bigger and submerged below consciousness. And just as the underwater part of the iceberg drives the speed and direction of the iceberg, so does the unconscious mind steer personality and behavior. You may think that you're in charge, but you're just actually hanging on for the ride. In addition to levels of consciousness, Freud discusses the structure of personality, which consists of the id, the ego, and the superego. And this is how they come on board in that order. So let's start with id. A baby is born into the world with a personality consisting totally of id. The baby wants what the baby wants when the baby wants it. The baby is really unaware and uncaring about any other living soul. It is totally helpless and dependent on us as parents and caretakers for survival. And it seeks pleasure and the avoidance of pain. It operates according to the pleasure principle. A few years later, ego develops and joins id. If the id is all about immediate gratification, well, the ego is more about delayed gratification. The young child begins to realize that he or she can't have everything they want. I have to wait my turn. I have to share. There are other people involved. The ego helps the young child develop strategies to cope with this frustration. The ego operates according to the reality principle. A few years later, superego develops and joins the id and ego to round out the structure of personality. The superego operates according to the moral principle. It acts as a judge of sorts of your thoughts and behavior and strives for moral perfection. The superego is essentially your conscience and can make you feel guilty or ashamed when you've done something wrong. It can be a harsh force, and the ego sometimes has to talk the superego down or get it to compromise with the id in certain circumstances. Here's an example of how the three structures of personality might interact with each other. Let's say you want to have a donut for dessert. Now the devil on one shoulder represents what? The id, the ego, or the superego? Pop quiz. It represents the id, doesn't it? And the id says, eat the donut. Donuts are good. Let's eat all the donuts you want. In fact, let's go on a donut diet and just eat donuts. And if we run out of donuts, we can always go down to Walmart. They'll make more. Well, that's pretty irrational, isn't it? The angel on the other shoulder, now what does the angel represent? The ego or superego? The angel represents the superego, doesn't it? The superego says, don't eat that donut. Donuts are bad. Sugar and chocolate are bad. You should never eat another donut for the rest of your life. In fact, if you even think of eating a donut, that's a sin, and you'll die and go to hell and burn for 1,000 years. That's the superego talking. Well, that's just as irrational, isn't it? So the ego steps in as a judge, as a police officer, to problem solve the conflict and come up with a workable solution. Think, how might the ego solve this conflict? What could the ego come up with? Well, the ego might say, hey, you can have a donut and sugar and candy every now and then. Just make sure that you continue working out and exercising and eating your vegetables, and you should be just fine. That's a solution based on reality, isn't it? That's what the ego does. The ego normally does a good job, but sometimes it gets overwhelmed and bullied by the id, the superego, or both, and it needs to call in reinforcements called defense mechanisms. And that's where we'll pick up on part 3. See you then. Bye-bye.